For me, this has been a search for the truth, searching for the truth of my father and searching for the truth of who killed Elizabeth Short.
Some headlines hit like a punch to the gut. Others unfold slowly, lingering in your mind for days, making you question everything you thought you knew. The Black Dahlia mystery solved isn't just a headline, it's a gut punch and a mind worm rolled into one. It's the kind of announcement that freezes time. You read it, reread it, and suddenly you're sitting up straighter. Your coffee goes cold, and you realize this isn't just another twist in a decades-old cold case. This is the twist, the final turn, the truth finally revealed, and it's darker than we ever imagined. The weight of a headline. For over 75 years, the murder of Elizabeth Short has sat like a splinter in the collective psyche of America. Not because it was the most gruesome crime we've seen, although by all accounts it was horrifying, but because it was unsolved. It lingered like a ghost at the edge of popular culture, feeding off speculation, conspiracy, and the morbid curiosity of generations. Everyone thought they had the answer. Amateurs, authors, retired cops, podcasters, each swore they'd cracked it. But this isn't one of those speculative theories. This isn't a hot take or a Reddit thread gone viral. This is the real deal. What's shocking isn't just who did it or how it was covered up. It's what the truth says about us, our institutions, our heroes, our justice system. The unsettling part isn't that it took decades to solve. It's that it could have been solved so much sooner if the people who were supposed to care actually did. The case wasn't just buried in time, it was buried in politics, reputation, and fear. And now, with the lid finally off, the smell isn't just of rot and decay, it's of corruption, cowardice, and complicity. The Black Dahlia case has always been bigger than one woman's tragic end. It's a mirror held up to the face of post-war America, a glamorous, gritty, noir reflection of a city bursting at the seams with ambition and secrets. And now the mirror has cracked wide open. The image staring back is nothing like the myths. It's worse. The truth doesn't cleanse, it contaminates. And now that it's out, there's no going back. So here we are, at the end of the mystery, but the start of something much harder to swallow. It's not just the resolution of a crime, it's the reopening of a wound we didn't even know was still bleeding. Where it all started. To understand the weight of the final revelation, we have to go back to where it all began. Los Angeles, January 1947. Post-war America was buzzing with optimism, but the undercurrent of violence and desperation flowed just beneath the surface, especially in the City of Angels. LA wasn't just glitz and palm trees. It was a town bursting with newcomers, broken dreams, and hidden crimes. It was in this city, unforgiving, wild, and on the brink of modern celebrity culture, that a young woman named Elizabeth Short was found mutilated, bisected, and posed in a vacant lot near Leimert Park. The murder scene was so gruesome, so theatrical, that it instantly captured national attention. Not even Hollywood, with all its twisted screenplays and shadowy backlots, could have written a crime like this. Elizabeth Short was 22. She had dark hair, a beauty mark on her cheek, and 1,000 rumors orbiting her name before her body was even cold. The press dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a nod to the popular film The Blue Dahlia, and to her penchant for black clothing. The nickname turned her into something between a tragic substance and a macabre icon, and it stuck like glue. She wasn't just a murder victim, she became a symbol, a mystery, a myth, and that myth grew legs. The LAPD was immediately under pressure. The brutality of the killing, the staging of the body, and the public outcry demanded action. Over 150 suspects were interviewed. Dozens of confessions poured in, most of them false or delusional. The investigation was chaotic from the start. Evidence was lost, leads were mishandled, and the press ran wild with speculation. Reporters even received handwritten letters, allegedly from the killer, taunting police and including personal belongings of the victim. But nothing stuck. and nothing moved forward. Within weeks, the case stalled. Then came the theories: a disgraced doctor, a jealous lover, a police informant, a Hollywood mogul, a random madman. Over the decades, everyone from amateur sleuths to best-selling authors tried to solve it. Theories flourished because hard facts were few and far between.
Because the killer was sure that it would be found fairly quickly, as it was. Clearly, he wasn't trying to hide it. He wanted the notoriety.
The vacuum of truth invited wild speculation, and the Black Dahlia became less of a real person and more of a cultural fixation. Her face, porcelain pale, lips painted with the crude smile of death, was plastered everywhere. Her life was dissected as much as her death. Was she a femme fatale, a desperate drifter, a young woman chasing dreams and safety in a city that promised neither? What got lost in all the noise was the woman herself. Elizabeth Short was human. She had family. She had fears. She had flaws. She wasn't a riddle to be solved or a fantasy to be fetishized, but the way her case was handled and sensationalized made sure the focus stayed on the mystery, not the victim. Over the years, the case became a symbol of all the things that could go wrong in a city that prides itself on reinvention. Corruption, indifference, incompetence. It was all there. And while the murder itself faded from headlines, it never really left the American imagination. It stayed alive in books, in films, in TV dramas, and in the ever-growing world of true crime media. People were fascinated not because they knew who killed Elizabeth Short, but because they didn't. The not knowing became the obsession, until now. The official revelation. There was no press conference at first, no grand announcement with flashing cameras and a badge-waving police chief making promises. The news started with a leak, a quiet, almost buried paragraph in a long investigative report by a local Los Angeles journalist who had been combing through declassified FBI documents. It didn't shout, it whispered, but the whisper was enough to ignite a storm. The Black Dahlia case had been solved, and not by accident. What followed in the days after was a slow, careful unraveling of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The killer's name wasn't unfamiliar, and that was part of the problem. He wasn't a shadowy drifter or a forgotten criminal. He was someone who had once walked freely among powerful men. He had worked inside the medical community, had ties to law enforcement, and even had brief connections to Hollywood. And most disturbingly, he had been protected, not necessarily because he was loved, but because exposing him would have brought down too many others with him. The evidence came from a trove of materials once believed to be lost: a sealed set of LAPD internal memos, anonymous letters, medical photographs, and transcripts from long-forgotten witness interviews. These files, uncovered during a digital archiving project, were cross-referenced with new forensic technology. A partial fingerprint found on one of the envelopes sent to the Los Angeles Examiner in 1947 was tested again, this time using enhanced biometric reconstruction. The match wasn't just suggestive, it was conclusive. The killer was a respected surgeon, long dead by now, who had a documented history of erratic behavior, complaints from hospital staff, and connections to known criminal elements in mid-century Los Angeles. More chillingly, it appeared that Elizabeth Short had crossed paths with him weeks before her murder, not in the way tabloids had long suggested, but through a mutual acquaintance tied to an underground medical clinic that quietly operated outside the bounds of legal or ethical oversight. This wasn't just a case of a disturbed individual acting alone. The documents suggested an ecosystem of silence. Several LAPD officers from the original investigation had received guidance from higher up to avoid pursuing certain leads. There were quiet notes passed between departments, vague warnings written in margins of reports, even requests to destroy physical evidence that might unduly damage reputations. In one particularly haunting memo, an officer pleaded to continue pursuing the surgical lead.
How can you lose all of the physical evidence in the most important crime that LAPD's ever had?
Only to be reassigned days later. When confronted with the evidence, the current LAPD leadership didn't deny its weight. Instead, They held a subdued, almost somber briefing confirming the findings. They named the killer. They admitted past failures. They used words like regret, disgrace, and accountability. But even as they spoke, it was clear this was less a moment of justice and more an uncomfortable reckoning. What made this revelation so devastating wasn't just that the case was solvable all along, it was that it was never meant to be solved, at least not publicly. For decades, key individuals had decided that protecting institutions mattered more than protecting the truth. The silence wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of design. The public reaction was immediate and divided. For some, there was relief that the mystery was finally put to rest. For others, it was like finding out your favorite storybook had an alternate ending, one far less poetic, far more corrupt. The romantic noir mystery of the Black Dahlia was gone, replaced by a colder, more clinical reality. The system had failed, and the cover-up had lasted longer than the crime itself. Survivors and descendants of the people involved stepped forward. Some apologized. Some were furious. Some simply wept. A granddaughter of one of the original detectives said in a radio interview, "He always came home quiet. He drank a lot. I used to think it was just the job. But now I think he carried this with him." Hollywood, always circling the Dahlia myth, stayed largely quiet, at least at first. Films and shows had painted the story in so many shades of noir that the real truth felt almost too plain to dramatize. There was no grand chase, no poetic justice, just a trail of paperwork, a fingerprint, and a long, heavy silence broken far too late. What remained, more than anything, was discomfort. People wanted closure, but the truth didn't feel like closure. It felt like exposure, the kind that left not just individuals, but entire systems out in the open. And the question that lingered wasn't just, why did he do it? It was, why did no one stop him? The revelation didn't make Elizabeth Short's death easier to understand. It made it harder.
Kind of training where you can actually invade a human body unless you've had some surgical experience, in my opinion.
It removed the veil of mystery but revealed something worse beneath it, a landscape of institutional protection, moral shortcuts, and a quiet agreement to look the other way when the truth became too costly. So yes, the Black Dahlia mystery was solved, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an overdue confession, and for many, that's what made it hurt the most. Because when a truth this dark is finally brought into the light, what happens next isn't celebration, it's consequences. Not just for the people involved, but for the systems that let it happen. The mystery is gone, but what replaces it? What do we do with a truth that indicts not just one man, but an entire culture of silence? The fallout, as it turns out, may be even harder to process than the crime itself. When the truth is worse than fiction, it's one thing to discover a killer. It's another thing entirely to uncover everything that helped him stay hidden. Once the headlines began circulating and the truth of the Black Dahlia case settled into the public consciousness, something odd happened. People didn't feel satisfied. They felt sick. And not because the case was gruesome, it always was, but because the truth didn't offer the kind of closure people expected. Instead, it opened a door no one really wanted to walk through. The murder had always been terrifying, but the cover-up? That was terrifying in a different way. It wasn't driven by rage or madness. It was cold, quiet, and calculated. The revelation that respected officials had shelved evidence, moved detectives off the case, or outright ignored leads shattered a kind of unspoken trust. People like to believe the system, though flawed, still tries to do the right thing. This case proved that wasn't always true. In the face of political ambition, public image, and institutional self-preservation, justice was optional. What followed was a kind of collective moral hangover. There were editorials and op-eds, think pieces, and televised roundtables. Words like institutional failure, misconduct, and structural rot became part of the national conversation. People began to revisit other cases from the same era. Were they mishandled too? Who else slipped through the cracks because someone thought protecting a reputation mattered more than pursuing justice? Former officers were called out by name.
Reports recommending whether or not to file charges to the district attorney.
Many of them no longer alive to defend themselves. Their families were blindsided, some of them angry, others apologetic. Old partners spoke anonymously to reporters, admitting they'd had suspicions back then, but didn't push because they didn't want to ruin their careers. One retired officer, now in his 90s, gave a phone interview to a local news station. His voice trembled as he said, "We weren't just told to back off. We were warned. We all got quiet."
A son who hates his father and stuff. This is a daddy dearest thing.
The shockwaves didn't stop at the LAPD. Several federal agencies were mentioned in the unearthed documents, including names of officials who had received early reports but chose not to follow up. Internal investigations were launched, and although many of the players were long gone, the culture they helped shape wasn't. That culture of protecting power, avoiding scandal, and sacrificing accountability was still recognizable. The past, it seemed, wasn't just a history lesson, it was a mirror. The most painful part was how many people were complicit simply by staying silent. The journalists who buried leads, the detectives who looked the other way, the city leaders who knew enough to ask questions but chose not to. No one wanted to admit they'd played a role in letting Elizabeth Short's story become legend instead of justice. The public's relationship with the case changed overnight. For years, it had been a noir fantasy, wrapped in vintage glamour and shadowy speculation. There were books and podcasts and dramatic reenactments, but suddenly, none of it felt appropriate. The mystique was gone, and in its place was something raw and uncomfortable. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a mystery anymore. She was a reminder of what happens when a society turns a woman's death into a story, instead of a crime worth solving. Not everyone took the news well. Some refused to believe it. Conspiracy theories sprouted instantly, challenging the official narrative. Social media was filled with debates about whether the documents were forged, the fingerprint planted, the confession coerced posthumously. After so many years of myth, the truth didn't feel believable, almost as if people preferred the shadows to the harshness of light. And yet, there were also those who felt something close to relief. People who had studied the case for years, historians, advocates, even casual followers, finally had an answer. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. For Elizabeth Short's remaining family, there was no celebration, just silence. A niece issued a short statement. "Thank you to those who never stopped looking. We are grateful, but our grief has no expiration date." Perhaps the most sobering realization in the aftermath was this. The crime had long since passed, but the damage hadn't. The murder didn't just take one life. It fractured trust. It showed how easy it was for the truth to be buried, not because it was unknowable, but because it was inconvenient. And now that the truth is out in the open, the question is no longer who killed the Black Dahlia. It's what else have we chosen not to see? Media's role then and now. The media didn't just cover the Black Dahlia case, it created it. From the moment Elizabeth Short's body was discovered in that vacant lot, the press pounced on the story with the kind of frenzy usually reserved for movie stars and political scandals. But this wasn't just news, it was an opportunity. In 1947, newspapers were battling for attention in a crowded, competitive market, and a murder this brutal, mysterious, and photogenic was the kind of story editors dreamed of. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a victim. She became a headline, a brand, a myth. It started with the name. Elizabeth Short had barely been identified when reporters began calling her the Black Dahlia, a nickname allegedly inspired by her dark clothing and a film noir playing in theaters at the time. That one poetic twist turned her from a murdered woman into a mystery worth selling. Front pages ran photos of her in posed studio shots, painting her as a seductive starlet. Articles speculated on her love life, her mental state, her ambitions. Some painted her as a tragic beauty, others hinted at moral failure. Either way, the focus wasn't on who killed her, it was on who she was supposed to be. And the press didn't just report on the case, they interfered with it. Reporters beat detectives to witnesses, published rumors as facts, and even tampered with evidence by publishing letters allegedly sent by the killer. One paper went so far as to call Elizabeth Short's mother, pretending her daughter had won a beauty contest just to get more personal details for a profile. The ethical line wasn't blurred, it was ignored entirely. Fast forward 70-plus years, and the media hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. When the revelation finally came out, the fingerprint match.
Sure appreciate your help, Jimmy. Takes days to get fingerprint reports through the mails.
The sealed documents, the institutional cover-up. The story didn't explode in quite the same way. At first, it trickled. A few respected outlets ran the facts cautiously, verifying sources, checking the newly declassified records. But the modern media machine, built for speed and clicks, took its time processing a truth that didn't have the glitz of theory or the drama of a courtroom showdown. After years of sensational coverage, it was almost as if the press didn't know how to handle the real answer. There was no glamour in institutional rot, no viral angle in quiet accountability. It was easier, in a way, when the mystery was alive, when the story was open-ended and full of sinister possibilities. The truth was far less fun to tell. Some media outlets did try to correct the narrative. They ran retrospectives, editorials acknowledging past failures, even apologies for decades of exploitative coverage. But others doubled down, questioning the new evidence or trying to revive old suspects for the sake of engagement. The same headlines that once called Elizabeth Short a lonely drifter or aspiring actress with secrets now hesitated to let her be seen simply as what she was, a young woman who was brutally killed and unjustly forgotten. There was also a reckoning in the world of entertainment. Documentaries, podcasts, even scripted series had made careers out of the mystery. Suddenly, all those polished theories and dramatic reenactments felt tone-deaf. Some shows quietly pulled episodes, others released statements. A few doubled back to address the real outcome. Still, the realization lingered. Had we all, in some way, helped keep the tragedy alive for entertainment's sake? The media didn't kill Elizabeth Short, but it helped bury her story beneath decades of drama and distortion. It made her infamous for the wrong reasons. And when the truth finally emerged, the silence from some corners of the press spoke louder than any front-page headline. Because when a mystery is profitable, the truth can feel like bad business. But justice doesn't owe anyone a satisfying plot twist. It just asks to be heard. Institutional accountability. Once the name of the killer was made public and the documents began circulating, the focus quickly turned from who to how. Not how he did it, that much was horrifyingly clear, but how he got away with it. For decades, the answer, it turned out, wasn't a single error or a rogue bad actor. It was a pattern, a culture, a system that chose silence over truth and preservation over justice. The LAPD was the first to face the spotlight. In the late 40s, the department was already battling corruption scandals, internal power struggles, and a growing reputation for aggressive image management. Solving the Black Dahlia case would have been a victory, but only if it led to a clean, palatable outcome. When the most promising lead turned out to be a man with ties to the elite medical community, city officials, and even some department insiders, that potential victory turned into a public relations nightmare. So the case wasn't just shelved, it was slowly buried. What the documents revealed wasn't a smoking gun, but a coordinated series of decisions designed to protect certain people and institutions. Key evidence was labeled as unverified, even when it was actionable. Witness statements were discredited on technicalities. Files were marked for internal use only. In a few places, officers had scrawled handwritten notes warning others to stay clear of specific leads. And every time someone got close to pushing the case forward, they were reassigned, silenced, or let go. This wasn't a case of missed clues. It was a case of manufactured dead ends. And it didn't stop with the LAPD. The district attorney's office had received early versions of the forensic analysis pointing to the eventual suspect, but never pursued an indictment. Federal agents were aware of connections between the suspect and multiple unsolved cases, but deemed them outside the Bureau's jurisdiction. A handful of doctors who worked alongside the killer had raised concerns about his behavior, but were pressured to remain silent to avoid reputational damage to their hospitals. At the time, protecting institutional credibility was more important than exposing individual wrongdoing. That attitude, so deeply ingrained, allowed the killer to disappear back into daily life, his crime reduced to whispers and redacted memos. The city moved on. The police department turned the page, and the woman at the center of it all faded into myth because the truth was considered too messy to tell. Once the modern-day revelations were made public, there were calls for accountability, formal apologies, internal reviews, even legislative proposals for better cold case transparency. A special city commission was assembled to review historical investigative failures, but many critics saw it as symbolic. After all, most of the people responsible were long gone. What could be done now that wouldn't feel a decade or a lifetime too late? Still, something had changed. Trust had cracked, and even if full justice was impossible, there was now a growing demand for reckoning. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reassessing their own archives. Journalists called for broader access to sealed case files. Advocacy groups pushed for reforms that would prevent similar cover-ups from happening again. Because the Black Dahlia case wasn't just a failure of a murder investigation, it was a reminder of how easily truth can be suppressed when the people in power decide it's safer that way. It showed how an institution designed to protect could just as easily protect itself at the expense of the vulnerable. And that's the part that still stings. Not just that Elizabeth Short died, but that her voice was silenced twice. First by her killer, then by the very people who should have fought to speak for her. Elizabeth Short, rehumanizing the victim. For decades, Elizabeth Short was a name people recognized, but not as a person. She was an image, a nickname, a headline, the Black Dahlia. It had a cinematic ring to it, dramatic and dark, like a character out of a mystery novel. But the real woman behind the myth had a life, not a script. She wasn't born in scandal. She didn't grow up in shadows. She was just someone trying to find her place in a world that didn't always offer kindness. Elizabeth was born in Boston in 1924. Her early years weren't glamorous. Her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression, and her mother raised 5 daughters alone. Like many women of her generation, Elizabeth wanted something different, something bigger. She moved from place to place, often staying with friends or distant relatives, working modest jobs, and holding on to dreams that never quite took shape. She wasn't an actress, despite the myth. She wasn't in the mob. She wasn't leading a double life. She was just a young woman in Los Angeles, navigating a city that promised hope, but often delivered heartbreak. She struggled with health issues and had her share of personal setbacks, but she also had charm, kindness, and the kind of openness that made people remember her. She wanted to be seen, not as a symbol, but as someone real. When she was murdered, the media quickly erased her complexity. They turned her into a mystery to be solved, not a life to be honored. But in all the pages and photos, what often got left out were the ordinary details, the letters she wrote to her family, the stories from people who knew her as quiet and thoughtful, or the simple fact that she once hoped to open a beauty shop. Now that the case is solved, the story shifts. And in that shift, there's a small but important opportunity to give Elizabeth Short back the dignity she was denied, to talk about her not as a tragic figure or a cautionary tale, but as a human being. She was 22 years old. She had fears, ambitions, and a future she never got to live. It's not too late to tell her story the right way, not through mystery, but through memory. Can we handle the truth? The Black Dahlia case has haunted the public imagination for nearly 8 decades. not just because of the gruesome nature of the crime, but because it embodied our collective fascination with mystery, darkness, and the unknown. Now that the mystery is solved, the question shifts from curiosity to responsibility. Can we handle the truth? Can we confront the uncomfortable realities about the institutions that failed Elizabeth Short and countless others? The truth is never as neat as the stories we tell ourselves. It's messy, painful, and often disappointing, but it is also necessary. To honor Elizabeth Short's memory means more than solving a cold case. It means recognizing the human cost of silence and complicity. It means demanding better from the systems meant to protect us. As the myth fades, what remains is a call to remember Elizabeth Short as she truly was. A young woman whose life was stolen, a victim whose voice was muted, and whose story deserves to be told with honesty, respect, and justice. What do you think of the story? Write your comments below, and if you love more content like this, subscribe to the channel for free.